Boom! Clap clap! The deafening sound of explosions and gunshots continued to enter his ears, irritating people's eardrums. The flying bullets flew past Lin Ji's body, almost hitting him several times. He could even clearly feel the bullets rubbing against him. The heat from the skin as it flies over. He clung to the long spear in his hand, looking at the unfamiliar scene around him, and his half-awake brain jolted for a while. At this moment, the chest of a soldier in a blue military uniform standing beside him was attacked from right in front of him. The bullet hit, and the warm blood splashed onto Lin Ji's face. The real touch made him wake up instantly. Where am I? Shouldn't I be at home? He was terrified with hindsight, and before he could sort out his thoughts, he was hit the shoulder, and a middle-aged man in a triangular hat spoke viciously to him in a language he had never heard before. Roared, "Lieutenant Cross, regroup your men and move on. Aim at your enemies and shoot at them." Second Lieutenant Cross. Although Lin Ji wondered why the man in front of him called him that, but his body seemed to be out of his control, he raised the musket in his hand, aimed at the people in white military uniforms lined up in front of him, and pulled the trigger. Boom! The flint slammed the edge of the fire door, the sparks ignited the gunpowder, and then a dazzling spark burst out from the muzzle. Charlie's shoulder was also hit by the recoil of the fired musket. After he pulled the trigger, he stood up. One of the men across from him had a mess on his thigh, and fell to the ground screaming. "Go forward! For the king!" Beep beep, accompanied by a rapid horn sound, the soldiers in blue military uniforms led by the man in the cocked hat roared one after another, raised their muskets, and charged towards the white army on the opposite side. Lin Ji was also surrounded by the crowd and ran forward. They got up, and while they were running, several artillery pieces on the opposite side shot at them, and the high-speed moving solid artillery shells roared into the crowd, directly slicing off the head of a charging soldier. The soldier whose head was chopped off did not fall to the ground immediately. The headless corpse was still running forward for a certain distance according to instinct, before losing control and falling to the ground. Lin Ji caught this scene in his eyes, his face was full of horror, and his stomach turned upside down. He wanted to suppress the desire to vomit, but he couldn't help but vomit out while running. At this moment, the front line consisting of white soldiers raised their muskets again and aimed at Lin Ji and the others who were charging. After passing a distance of more than 10 meters, he could clearly see the numb expression and hollowness of one of the soldiers' eyes. Bang bang bang! White gunpowder smoke shrouded the front of the white soldiers with a round of salvos. The soldiers running seemed to be hit by an invisible heavy punch in the air. When he fell, the severe pain quickly spread from his chest to his whole body. Lin Ji, who fell to the ground, wanted to climb forward reluctantly. The fear of death gradually took over his brain, but he fell into the darkness along with the rapidly dissipating consciousness. Abyss! Hey! Suddenly sitting up from the temperatureless hospital bed, Lin Ji gasped heavily, cold sweat covered his forehead, and also wet the white bandage wrapped around his chest. If you look closely, you can still see a little seepage of blood. He raised his hand to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead, and tried his best to calm down his breathing. After taking a few deep breaths, he finally calmed himself down. He lifted the quilt over him and stood up from the hospital bed. There were several other officers who were also injured in this room. They were not woken up. They were lying on the bed snoring and snoring. Can overturn the roof. This is the medical station in the fortress. Lin Ji was already lying here when he regained consciousness 2 days ago. He had a bandage on his chest where he was hit by the musket, but he didn't feel any pain from the injury, this thanks also to the system that brought him back to life. Standing outside the room, Lin Ji took a deep breath, inhaled the fresh air into his lungs, converted it into turbid carbon dioxide, and slowly exhaled it. A gust of cold wind blew through, making him feel a chill on his sweat-soaked back. The yard in front of him was full of tents. When there were not enough beds in the ward, the military doctors could only set up tents in the yard, put down as many camp beds as possible, and put the wounded soldiers who had nowhere to put them here. At this time, it was late at night, and from time to time in the yard, the wounded soldiers could still be heard babbling, coughing, and snoring. At this moment, a person suddenly walked out of the tent in the yard. The other party was holding a kerosene lamp. When he saw Lin Ji standing outside the corridor, he was stunned for a moment, and then he recognized the other party by the light of the kerosene lamp. Identity of. He stopped in front of Lin Ji, gave a military salute, and asked, "Second Lieutenant Cross, why are you standing outside so late?" Lin Ji glanced at the other party. He was wearing a white robe with a red cross drawn on it. He was a military doctor in the medical station. "It's nothing, I'll go back later." Rather than calling him by his real name, it's more appropriate to call him Charlie Close now. His current body is no longer the yellow-skinned and black-haired youth of the 21st century, but the body of a Caucasian youth, a pale face with long fluffy blonde hair, tied at the back of his head because he was too lazy. The short ponytail left by the grooming is a very typical Western face. His cheeks are thin and his cheekbones are somewhat prominent. Since he came to the front line with the army, he has rarely had the chance to gain weight. The fierce war made him look haggard, and his eyes with blue pupils were bloodshot. At first glance, he looked like a legendary vampire. Generally nasty. The consciousness of the original owner of this body has long since vanished, and it has been completely absorbed by the soul of Lin Ji from the 21st century, who also died in the following war. It is not because of some kind of supernatural being that he is still here. Events, no, in a sense, the existence of the system does carry the shadow of supernatural events. That is the Total War system, named after the game Total War, which is well known by Charlie's previous life. It will resurrect the dead Charlie and give him the ability to recruit soldiers. Of course, like in the game, he also needs money to recruit soldiers. Now he has an opportunity to recruit a line of infantry and his general guards for free. After that, he needs to use real gold coins to recruit. Read www.yuyuganshu.com, and after being recruited, he has to pay military salaries and provide ammunition refills. In other words, in his current status as a second lieutenant, he can't afford to support a line infantry company. Moreover, in this front line full of troops, he rashly recruited a company to come out, and he would only kill himself and let himself die again. He has already tasted death, and no matter what, he doesn't want to try it again. Hearing what Charlie said, the military doctor instructed, "Then go back quickly, and I'll change the bandages for you tomorrow morning." "I see." Charlie nodded in agreement, then watched the military doctor leave with the kerosene lamp, and watched his gradually disappearing figure. Charlie suddenly became a little dazed. He thought again of the mysterious system that pulled him back from the abyss of death. If you guessed wrong, the template used by that system was the game Napoleon Total War he had played. The timeline was in the early 18th century, and the level of technology was not much different from the era he was in now. According to the consciousness and memory of the original owner absorbed by Charlie, he can know that the area he is in is called Edmund, which is the front line of the war between the Kingdom of Rumont and the Kingdom of Okolos. Both sides have successively deployed 2 armies in this area. The number of soldiers involved in the war was more than 30,000. More than 30,000 soldiers and countless artillery fought fiercely in the Edmund Hills. From the outbreak of the war in December last year to June, it is conservatively estimated that at least more than 10,000 soldiers were buried here. It has become a veritable place. Meat grinder. After the attack failed 2 days ago, the 2nd Blood Lion Combat Brigade, to which he belonged, had to withdraw to Fort Edford for repairs, and wait for the order of the military after restaffing. The next morning, the military doctor arrived as scheduled to help Charlie remove the blood-stained bandage tied to his chest. After the bandage was removed, he looked at the scarred wound on Charlie's chest with a surprised look on his face. "Second Lieutenant Cross, it's unbelievable that your wounds healed so quickly," he exclaimed in shock. His shouting attracted an old military doctor next to him, who also followed, looking at the wound that had scarred and growing new granulation, and muttered in surprise. God is good, his wounds recovered so quickly. I still remember that when he was sent here a few days ago, he was beaten to death by a musket in his chest, and when the bullets were dug out, it was almost dead. I didn't expect it to be short. It's become like this in just 3 days. After speaking, he stared at Charlie, who was sitting on the bed with wide eyes again, and asked, "Lieutenant Cross, how are you feeling now?" "I think it's not bad," Charlie replied leisurely. "If I can, I even want to return to the team today." He knew very well in his heart that he was able to recover so quickly thanks to the help of the system. Without the system, he would have become a cold and stiff corpse by now, and even if he was lucky enough to save his life, he would have to lie down for at least several months. Return to the team. The 2 military doctors looked at each other, and the older one said, "We have to conduct a thorough examination on you. If your injury is indeed fine, then you can return to the team. Rice, you will take him to check later, and I will send someone to inform his troops." The military doctor named Rice agreed. After removing all the bandages on Charlie's body, he said to him, "Second Lieutenant Cross, please come with me." A few hours later, Charlie, who was dressed in his brand new military uniform, walked out of the medical station. As soon as he stepped out of the gate, he saw 2 men in blue military uniforms greet him. Charlie glanced at them, and quickly searched the memory of the 2 of them in his mind, and quickly remembered their identities. One of them was a sergeant under Charlie, whose name was Murad Melki, and the other was Sergeant Major Rufus Richter in company headquarters. When he saw Sergeant Major Rufus, Charlie was obviously stunned for a moment. The latter 2 went straight to him and gave a military salute. Then the Sergeant Major said, "Second Lieutenant Cross, we have been ordered to pick you up and return to the team." Charlie nodded and followed them to the direction of the station. At the same time, he also asked about the current company's battle damage, as well as the battle situation and information about his hospitalization in the past few days. Through Rufus' report, Charlie learned that nearly half of his 2nd Rifle Company had been killed in the previous battle, and several officers, including the lieutenant, were also on the list. There were only 26 people left in the 2nd row. In the military system of the Roumont Kingdom, a company has 120 soldiers and 2 platoons, and the platoon is composed of 60 soldiers, which shows how high the death rate is. This makes Charlie secretly glad. If there is no, the system resurrected him, and he will also be a member of the dead list at this time. As a platoon leader, Charlie originally had 2 sergeant squad leaders, but one of them was shot and killed while charging with Charlie, leaving only Murad alone. The recruits recruited from the rear are still about 3 days away from the fortress. Before the recruits arrive, they can take the opportunity to give themselves a vacation to ease their nervousness shortly after being withdrawn from the battlefield. At the same time, Rufus and Charlie also revealed a battle situation on the front line. After they withdrew, the friendly army who succeeded them broke through the enemy defense line that was crippled by the 2nd Brigade, which greatly eased the pressure on the front line. If there is an accident, after they are finished repairing, they can directly enter the border of the Okolos Kingdom when they step on the battlefield again. This is indeed good news for the Rumen Kingdom, which has suffered repeated defeats. Since the Kingdom of Okolos and its allies declared war on the Rumen Kingdom last year, the kingdom has fallen into the dilemma of two-front warfare. The army has received intelligence due to serious corruption issues. The lag and the snow on the roads in winter caused the reaction speed to be too slow. The border troops stationed at the border were retreating under the attack. It was not until the famous General Deborah Claus, who was over 70 years old, was ordered to finally recover the defeat and start a counterattack. Charlie's 2nd Brigade was in the battle sequence of the 3rd Army. The original owner of his body also witnessed with his own eyes how the 3rd Army retreated from defeat to stabilize its position, and finally regained lost ground and pushed the front line back to the border between the 2 countries. Just when Charlie recovered his thoughts, he heard Rufus say in an adoring tone, "Sure enough, Only under the command of Marshal Claus can the Third Army exert its due combat effectiveness. If you count on those arrogant masters, we've been driven back to Ankerton by now." Hearing his words, Charlie was stunned, and the figure of an old man with a serious face gradually appeared in his mind, and then he heard Rufus looking at him with curious eyes, and asked, "Second Lieutenant Cross, I wanted to ask you a long time ago, what is the relationship between you and the Marshal? You are both surnamed Claus." "It doesn't matter." Charlie shook his head with a smile and said, "He is a famous general of the generation above, and I am just a second lieutenant who has just joined the army." "That's such a pity," Rufus said, then changed the subject and led Charlie to continue walking in the direction of the station. Soon after, the three of Charlie returned to the company station, Yu reading www. As soon as yuyuganshu.com returned to the station, he was taken to company headquarters by Rufus and met with his immediate superior, Captain Hernan Doyle. This is an iron-blooded man with a ferocious scar on his left cheek. When Charlie entered the room, he was sitting behind the desk and processing the list of dead soldiers. Charlie knocked on the open door first. After entering the room, he and Rufus held a fist with their right hand and beat their left chest together, and gave a military salute. "Captain Doyle, Charlie Close is reporting to you and applying to return to the team," he said. As soon as he finished speaking, he saw Captain Doyle stand up, walked around the desk, and hugged Charlie warmly, and said at the same time, "Charlie, I'm glad you can escape from the hands of death, otherwise I will lose at the same time." Two capable subordinates. The other of the two capable subordinates he mentioned was the lieutenant in command of the 1st Platoon, that is, the middle-aged man who had previously ordered Charlie to reorganize his subordinates. During the charge, he was hit in the head by a flying bullet and died on the spot. "How is your injury recovery? The last time I saw you, you were lying on the bed with blood, and you were in a coma. I didn't expect that after less than 3 days, you were actually able to get up and move around." "Sir, the military doctor did a physical examination for me. They said that my injury has almost recovered and I can return to the battlefield," Charlie said with a smile. "Very well, Charlie, I have another good news to tell you," Doyle said. Before Charlie asked, he continued, "After Robert's death, the 1st Platoon commander's position was vacated, and the regiment headquarters decided to appoint you as the 1st Platoon commander and give you the rank of Lieutenant Charlie, and you will be Lieutenant Cross from now on." At the end, he patted Charlie on the shoulder and finished in a congratulatory tone. "What does it feel like to be promoted from second lieutenant to lieutenant?" Charlie said he was indifferent. At least he didn't feel much change at the moment, because the soldiers he commanded were still in a platoon, and the only change seemed to be that the army's salaries were slightly higher than before. But this is far from enough. He still can't support a line of infantry companies and his general guard. During the 3 days of waiting for the arrival of the recruits, Charlie was trying to digest the original memory of this body, and summoned the remaining 35 soldiers in the 1st Platoon, announced the appointment of the regiment to them, and learned from them 2 seasoned veterans were re-elected to serve as squad leaders for the 2 squads, that is, sergeants. Strictly speaking, a sergeant is not an officer, but a soldier's rank. Therefore, in the Roumont Kingdom and even in the armies of various countries, a sergeant and corporal can be served by experienced soldiers from the bottom. As for the higher level lieutenant, basically by military academy students from aristocratic backgrounds. This also led to the rise of the lower level soldiers who were almost monopolized by the aristocracy. Except for some veterans who made great achievements, few people with non-aristocratic status were able to grant the rank of lieutenant. Charlie knows very well that such a system has great drawbacks. If the road to ascend is blocked, it will not be able to mobilize the enthusiasm of the soldiers. The noble officers who have been airborne will only talk about soldiers before this. Once they enter the real battlefield, they are prone to command errors. Problems, resulting in a loss of combat. 3 days later, the recruits arrived at Fort Edford under the of various barracks and battalions, along with ammunition supplies from the rear and various news from the country. This afternoon, Charlie and the company's logistics sergeant went to the east gate of the fortress to receive new recruits. When he arrived at the east gate, the place was already full of people, and the soldiers of the barracks maintained order on the scene. Young recruits in blue military uniforms, or tow carriages loaded with supplies across the road to the warehouse. Walking in a dense crowd, there are all kinds of noises in the ears, such as the shouts of soldiers, the voices of recruits, or the neighing of pack horses. Just when Charlie was just passing through a queue, he suddenly heard the crowd. Someone was shouting his name. He subconsciously followed the sound and saw a familiar face under his blue-trimmed triangular hat. "Nelson, why are you here?" He walked over and asked the person calling his name. "I'm the captain of the 2nd Rifle Company of the Barracks Battalion, Cross. I'm glad to see you standing here safe and sound." Anton Nelson hugged Charlie warmly. After letting go, he looked Charlie up and down. When he saw the latter's armband, he said in surprise, "Cross, have you been promoted to lieutenant so soon?" "I'm lucky, you know," Charlie said with a smile, and then he asked, "Why were you assigned to the barracks?" "I remember when you were still in the academy, you told me that you wanted to go to the number 1 in the north. Served in the 2nd Army." Hearing this, Anton curled his lips helplessly and said, "Don't mention it, my old man doesn't want me to go to the dangerous front line," and he directly asked the people from the army department to arrange for me a post in the rear of the barracks. "Shit, I'm almost getting moldy in the back." After finishing speaking, he looked at Charlie with admiration and said, "Cross, it would be great if my grandfather was like your grandfather, so that I can also go to the front and make a fortune, just like you were promoted to lieutenant so quickly. This comes at a price." Charlie touched the scar on his chest with a wry smile, and said, "I was hit by an enemy's bullet during the charge. If it wasn't for my luck to save my life, you probably would have just lost my life. I can go to the cemetery and see my tombstone." "Oh my God, Cross, did your grandfather know? If you really died on the battlefield, I bet he would regret it." Charlie shrugged and said he didn't know. He then changed the subject and asked, "You said you've been staying at the back, is there any fresh news?" "Speaking of this, I have one thing to remind you." Anton heard that as if he had remembered something, he said with a serious expression, "His Majesty the King held a cabinet meeting not long ago to prepare for those factory owners, businessmen and the peasants raised the tax rate, which aroused the opposition of the new nobles, and there were rumors in the city of Ankerton that the new nobles were trying to unite the northern kingdom of Hylde to overthrow the king's rule. Now the kingdom's army is basically sent to the front line, and the rear is empty. Regardless of whether the rumor is true or not, His Majesty will send a force from the front line to defend Ankerton city, but I don't know whether it is from the northern battlefield or here." "Shoes! That must be here. We have driven the Okalos back to the border. The 1st Army and the 2nd Army in the northern battlefield are still fighting hard. As long as the officials of the Ministry of War are still in their right minds, they will not the north, which has a tight source of troops, send troops back to defend." "You read www.uuganshu.com," Charlie analyzed. "Well, looking at the entire Western Front battlefield, only your 2nd Brigade is being renovated. If you guess correctly, His Majesty's messenger will come here soon and order you to go back." When they were talking, the logistics sergeant who came with Charlie had already signed the document and came over. He held a document in his hand, handed it to Charlie, and said, "Sir Cross, please take a look, if there is no problem, you can go right back." Charlie took the document in response and opened it to read. The document stated the number of recruits their company took, as well as the number of guns, ammunition, and uniforms. He glanced at it and returned it to the logistics sergeant, nodding at him to indicate that there was no problem. Then, he looked at the old acquaintance and settled down and said, "I'll go back first. You have to pay attention to safety. I hope the next time I see you, it's not in a cold cemetery." "Ha, you should pay attention to safety." Anton said, stepped forward, and hugged Charlie. After the two let go, Charlie took the logistics sergeant to the recruit camp and the warehouse to receive supplies. On the way back to the station, Charlie was thinking about the words he had just settled in. Anton is a student who graduated from the Royal Military Academy in the same period as Charlie. They are also classmates and friends. Anton Nelson's background is not small. His father, Nahas Nelson, is Duke Drake, the current Minister of State Legislative Affairs, and the most important king of the king. One of the most respected ministers, the only son of Anton was the only son under the Duke's knees, so he repeatedly forbade Anton from going to the front line, and even used his connections to keep him in the military depot in charge of logistics. There is no doubt about the credibility of the only son of the legislative minister's family. If you want to fully digest the content of his words, you must first talk about the current domestic situation in the Rumen kingdom. The Rumant kingdom is located in the west of the Marnes continent, with the Akalos kingdom to the west and the old enemy Hildi kingdom to the north, with a population of about 21 million people. King Loran Rumant ruled, more commonly known as King Loran XI. As I said earlier, the level of technology in the world Charlie is in is almost the same as that of the Earth in the 18th century. In this world, there is also an industrial revolution. After the Industrial Revolution, many steam-powered machines have sprung up in the Kingdom of Rumant. In the production industry, factories and chimneys rose from the ground, replacing the traditional handicraft workshops. These factories were basically built by the small and medium aristocrats behind the investment, and a few independent factory owners also donated property to the royal family. Granted titles, they are called new nobles along with the former two. For some strange reason, the old aristocrats are full of discrimination against these new aristocrats. They jokingly call the new aristocrats greedy vampires. This may be because of the miserable life of the workers and the harsh living environment, describing the new aristocrats as greedy vampires. The huge wealth obtained is based on the suffering of the bottom workers. The king was happy to see the confrontation between the old and the new nobles, but he was also unwilling to let go of the opportunity to make money. In addition, the years of wars led to excessive military spending and severe grain failures, which forced the country to buy grain from other countries, making the treasury a serious problem. Emptiness, so he took the advice of the old aristocracy to increase the war tax on factory owners, merchants, and peasants who had empty wealth but no great power. The reason why he doesn't collect taxes from the veteran nobles is because his rule relies heavily on the support of the veteran nobles. Most of the officers in the army are from big noble families. If they lose the support of these veteran nobles, the army of the kingdom without the command of the officers will be lost. Great loss of combat effectiveness. Anton said that the new nobles attempted to unite with the Hildi kingdom in the north to overthrow the king's rule. The power of the king was severely weakened through a large number of bills that benefited the interests of the bourgeois aristocracy. Although the nominal ruler was the king, he was actually the palace minister supported by the newly promoted aristocracy. King Loran XI has always imposed a trade blockade on the kingdom of Hildi, making it impossible for the latter's products to enter the vast market of the kingdom of Rumen. Although the kingdom of Rumen is also undergoing an industrial revolution, the scope of the Industrial Revolution is actually in most of the northern part of the kingdom and the surrounding areas of the capital Ankerton. The countryside is still in a stubborn and backward small-scale peasant economic system. The Hildi kingdom has always wanted to open the market of the Rumen kingdom and dump the products produced by domestic factories. There are only two ways to achieve their goals. One is to rely on the means of war to force the Rumen kingdom to sign a treaty, and the other is to unite with Rumen. The kingdom's new nobles overthrow King Loran once and for all. The first method is in progress, but since the main force of the Rumen kingdom has all gathered in the northern battlefield to stubbornly resist the attack of the old enemy army, there is no progress for a long time, so it is reasonable for them to switch to the second method. In order to resist the simultaneous attack of the two countries, all the troops of the kingdom were sent to the front line. If the new nobles took advantage of this opportunity to start a rebellion, the consequences would be disastrous. But what does this have to do with Chalai? With the total war system, the last thing he wants to see is eternal peace. Only years of war can give him a chance to rise. After Charlie led the team back to the station, he found that Captain Doyle had already returned. He frowned, as if he had heard bad news from the battalion headquarters. "Sir Doyle, what happened?" Charlie took the initiative to lean over and asked. "Klaus, we're in trouble." Doyle's first sentence made Charlie's heart subconsciously raise, and before he had time to ask, he heard Doyle speak again. "A battalion of the Okalos fled around Edford Fortress after being dispersed in the battle, threatening the supply line leading to the front line. The regiment ordered our battalion to set off immediately after the repairs to destroy this enemy." "What kind of trouble is this?" Charlie was at a loss. How could this be considered trouble when a reorganized battalion dealt with a dismantled battalion? Doyle smiled bitterly and said, "The point is, most of the soldiers in our battalion are recruits who have never been on the battlefield. They have just integrated into the team, and their cooperation with each other is worrying. Listening to orders, you also know that recruits who are new to the battlefield are more troublesome than tough enemies. This is a problem." Charlie nodded. He put his arms around his chest and began to think. Before long, his eyes lit up and he had an idea. Reading www.uuganshu.com. "We can hold a football match before we go out, not only to let the soldiers relax, but also to exercise their tacit understanding and cooperation in advance." "Football game? It's a good idea." Doyle's eyes also lit up. He clenched his fists and said, "Just one platoon can form 2 teams and reserve personnel? Cross, what a great idea you have." Charlie smiled slightly and did not continue to speak. The football game in this world has already matured, so there is no need for him, a traveler, to offer advice. Doyle was very efficient, and not long after Charlie made his suggestion, the man he sent came back with an ugly football that was wrapped in leather and, if nothing else, stuffed inside. In addition to animal bladders, there are only sundries such as fur and silk. Charlie took the football from the soldier and weighed it in his hand. It felt heavier and heavier than the football he had played in his previous life. The soldiers passing by saw the ugly football in Charlie's hand, and their faces showed surprise. Even children from poor families have played football, so there is no situation where people don't know it. A new sergeant under Charlie's command asked curiously, "Sir, what are you doing with a football? Are you going to hold a football match?" "You guessed it right," Charlie said with a smile. He turned to look at the soldiers passing by and said loudly, "We'll hold a football game here in a while. Welcome recruits to join the army. You all go back and prepare." When they heard that the football team was going to be held, the soldiers all cheered, especially the veterans. They had no way of entertainment during this period of time. Now that they finally have entertainment activities, their enthusiasm instantly increased. "Pass the ball! Pass the ball! Damn Habel, run fast, you'll be overtaken by them soon. Oh my God, why do I have a teammate as stupid as you are?" Outside the temporarily marked field, Captain Charlie and Doyle watched the lively field with a smile. Although the environment and conditions here were very simple, the soldiers still had a great time. Every goal they scored would attract soldiers watching. The cheers and shouts attracted people from other camps to join in to watch the fun. "Cross, let's not talk about whether your suggestion has any effect. Now it seems that holding this game can at least improve the morale of the soldiers." Charlie heard Captain Doyle's words. He glanced at the latter, who was smiling with satisfaction. He then echoed, "Sir, for an army, morale is as important as tacit understanding. Don't you think the soldiers have been suppressed for a long time?" "Indeed." Doyle sighed, his eyes looked around, and swept over the soldiers cheering outside the venue. After withdrawing from the battlefield, soldiers rarely have the opportunity to vent their emotions. The game is an opportunity for them to vent. As soon as he finished speaking, he saw the football brush past the goalkeeper's open arm and slammed into the temporary net. The next second, the soldiers on the sidelines cheered. Looking at the smiles of the soldiers, Charlie felt a little melancholy in his heart. After the war, he did not know how many of them would survive. The tactics of lining up to be shot were extremely cruel, and no one could predict the next second bullet. Will they hit themselves? The only thing they can do is to pray to the gods and wait for the arrival of death, panicking all day long. 3 days later, Charlie's 3rd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, left Fort Edford and went to the place where the 2nd Battalion of the enemy's 15th Line Infantry Regiment last appeared. After several days of repairs, the 3rd Combat Battalion has already completed the replenishment of 6 companies. Among these 6 companies, in addition to the 5 most basic rifle companies, there is also a Grenadier Company. Grenadiers are rifles. The promoted elites in the army have rich battlefield experience and superb combat ability. They often play the role of stabilizing the front line and breaking the situation in combat, and generally undertake more arduous tasks. And just like their names, each of them carries 2 most primitive round-heavy grenades. When encountering the enemy's defense line that is difficult to break through, they ignite the grenade and throw it at the enemy, and then launch a charge to break through the enemy's defense line in one fell swoop. Historically, the first recorded grenade throwers in the West appeared in Austria and Spain, while King Louis XIV of France included grenadiers as a formal soldier type in his military reforms in the late 17th century. At that time, his duty was a veritable soldier-throwing grenade. Because they were not equipped with guns, they were also considered death squads, and with the evolution of musket technology, this practice of breaking through enemy lines by throwing grenades was slowly abolished, but the title of grenadier was retained and continued to exist as an elite formation of battle infantry. In this world, the grenade-throwing tactic of grenadiers has not been abolished. When encountering a line of defense that is difficult to overcome, the grenadiers of various countries will still bravely throw grenades at the line of defense against the enemy's shooting. When Charlie saw that group of grenadiers who were taller and stronger than ordinary soldiers, his eyes were full of envy. Even if they just raised their hands, they could give people a feeling of being elite. Charlie remembered that there were also grenadiers in Napoleon's Total War. He couldn't help but look forward to the performance of the grenadiers produced by the system. According to the experience of so many Total War novels he had read, the arms produced by the system would definitely not be better than the indigenous soldiers. Difference. Just when Charlie was thinking about this, the scout with the army ran back from the front, and he came back with the news of the enemy. A friendly supply team not far ahead was besieged by the Okalos. They are stubbornly resisting, relying on the supply carriage, but because of the small number, the defense line is in jeopardy. As soon as they heard that the enemy was discovered, the emotions of the soldiers who were still immersed in the boring marching road suddenly became active. The faces of those recruits who had never been on the battlefield changed to a look of longing for war, but from their gestures, you can still see the tension and excitement it deserves. The veterans on the side looked at the excited recruits with disdain, as if mocking them for rushing to die. Why didn't the veterans come here like this? When they first entered the battlefield, they also longed to make achievements in the war. There was a lot of noise, but the cruelty and slaughter after the war broke all their fantasies about war in an instant. Soon, the order to attack came from the front following the footsteps of the messengers. Captain Doyle looked serious, and loudly ordered the soldiers to prepare for battle and follow the troops to the battlefield. Under the shouts of the officers of each company, read www.uugonshu.com. The marching speed of the entire battalion immediately increased. As they approached the battlefield, they could already hear the sound of gunfire not far ahead, and Charlie listened carefully. From the beginning to the end, there was only the sound of muskets being fired. It seemed that the rout soldiers did not carry heavy weapons. This is also normal, after all, it was withdrawn from the battlefield, not to mention that there is no artillery in the battalion. The heavy artillery alone is a great obstacle to escape. The 3rd Battle Battalion did not deliberately hide its whereabouts when it approached, so when they appeared on the other side of the battlefield, they were already discovered by the soldiers of both sides. Different, but with the naked eye, you can see that the offensive side of the attacking side stagnates, and there is a contraction. At this moment, a familiar but unfamiliar voice suddenly sounded in Charlie's mind, and the sudden voice almost made him fall off the horse in fright. Task Release Description: the remnants of the Okalos are besieging our supply line. Please participate in the next battle to defeat the enemy, and ensure that you or your subordinates kill at least 40 enemies. Reward: a random unit, 2,000 gold coins. Yes, it's a total war. Listening to the mission description and rewards, Charlie didn't have many emotional fluctuations in his heart. He glanced at the Okalos who were shrinking their company and preparing to meet the enemy. It could be seen that the other party knew that it was pointless to escape and was ready to fight. This task should be the legendary novice welfare. If you only rely on Charlie to kill 40 enemies, it is almost impossible. The accuracy of rifles in this era is outrageous, so the system will also put his subordinates into with that added in. It's not impossible for a platoon of 60 soldiers to kill 40 enemies. Forward. 3rd Battalion, forward. Blow the snare drum and play the military horn. Accompanied by the melodious and brisk military music and the rhythmic sound of the drums, the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion dressed in blue uniforms walked in an orderly pace under the leadership of the officers to Oka, who had completed the formation. The loose army advances. With their numbers at a disadvantage, the Okalos took a defensive stance against an enemy far outnumbered by them. They methodically loaded their ammunition, but their eyes were fixed on the slowly advancing Rumen Kingdom army. In this atmosphere, the new recruits on the Rumen Kingdom side no longer had the excitement they had before, and they were also infected by the emotions of the veterans, making them even more nervous. Check your firearms. Mistakes on the battlefield will only cost you lives. Charlie, who was walking on the side of the line, turned his head and ordered to the soldiers beside him. Under his eyes, he found that many soldiers were too tense and their legs were weak and trembling. It got messy, some people walked fast and some people walked slowly. He hurriedly maintained the front and asked them to supervise each other in groups. Perhaps because of the benefit of the football match, the soldiers of each group developed a certain tacit understanding on the field. After Charlie reminded them, they quickly maintained the marching front, and then looked at the other companies. They have not yet fought their lines. It has become distorted from the original flat, and even protruding and concave bits have appeared. In the absence of artillery on both sides, the battlefield before the battle was silent except for the bugles and drums of the 3rd Battalion. When the distance between the two sides was within 200 meters, the Okalos troops who were waiting in line began to shoot one after another, and dazzling flames exploded in front of their lines, and the smoke quickly obscured the sight of both sides. The shooting accuracy of about 200 meters was not as low as Charlie imagined. In less than a few seconds after the gunshots rang, several soldiers in the marching queue fell to the ground. The blood spattered from their wounds made the surrounding soldiers. There was a commotion, and some nervous soldiers also began to raise their guns to fight back, but were stopped by the corporal and sergeant in the queue. According to the infantry code of Rumen Kingdom, the best shooting range of a musket is within 150 meters. If you want to pursue higher killing efficiency, you need to let the infantry travel within a range of 100 meters to shoot, but in there as you advance, you will also be met with salvos from the enemy round after round, and no army can withstand such an attack without being defeated. Go on. Don't be afraid. Captain Doyle, who was leading the team at the front, encouraged the infantry under his command loudly. At this moment, a bullet swept his body and flew behind him, hitting the chest of a soldier who was praying to the gods. He only felt a sharp pain spread from his chest, and then he collapsed on the green grass. The comrade in arms behind the dead soldier stood up without saying a word. His eyes didn't stop at the twitching body on the ground. He didn't dare to look at it, because he was worried that the next person to fall would be him. All stand. Finally, after facing several rounds of shooting from the Okalos, the 3rd Battalion stopped at a position of about 150 meters. Under the command of the officer, the soldiers began to disperse their positions so that the people in the front and rear rows could shoot at the same time. Aim your gun. Swish fire. Fire all. Along with the roars of the officers of each company, the line infantrymen who were aiming their guns pulled the trigger one after another. The flint hit the fire door heavily, the sparks ignited the gunpowder, and the smoke immediately enveloped the entire front. Inside, the gunshots rang out for a moment, and the Okolo's army standing opposite them fell instantly. Go on! Go on! Do-do-do. In a new round of horns, the infantrymen of the 3rd Battalion stepped out of the defense line composed of gunpowder smoke while loading the muskets in their hands. After the gun was loaded, he raised the gun over his chest, pulled the trigger, and a soldier on the opposite side was shot and fell. And at the moment he fell, Charlie's mind sounded the cold count of the system 11/40. The company continued to advance. With their own superiority in numbers, they fired at the enemy as they advanced, and soon reached a position of about 100 meters. Then they launched a salvo at the enemy again, and inflicted greater casualties on the enemy at the same time. It also dealt a heavy blow to the low morale of the Okolos, which shook their fighting spirit. After this round of salvos, the 3rd Battalion continued to advance. Both the veterans and the transformed recruits had already touched the skirt of the goddess of victory. They cheered loudly and fired another round when they advanced to the 50-meter position. A salvo, and then, in the vain variation of the passionate horn sound, the entire battalion charged towards the precarious enemy line. Although it is a charge, it is more appropriate to describe it as chasing deserters. After a volley from 50 meters, the remaining Okolo's soldiers completely collapsed, turned, and fled, and their fragile backs were exposed. Under enemy gunfire, their hapless battalion commander was killed by one of the bullets in the final salvo, and the captains and company commanders were quickly chased, though futilely trying to salvage the fleeing soldiers. The soldiers who came up hit the ground with the of their guns and became prisoners of humiliation. Charlie didn't chase after the soldiers, and walked to Captain Doyle with the smell of gunpowder, looking at the body of the unfortunate battalion commander who died of a headshot, and teased, "Sir, it seems that this battle is going on. The regiment gave us the opportunity to train troops, what do you think?" Doyle naturally understood what he meant. He looked at the recruits who were chasing the deserters. The latter were no longer recruits after this battle. No matter if they killed an enemy with their own hands, at least they will be in the next battle. I can control my nervousness. At this moment, a cavalryman suddenly rushed from afar. He held the flag of the Roumont kingdom in his hand to show his identity, passed through the chaotic crowd, and ran all the way to the location of the camp flag. Charlie and Doyle looked at it suspiciously. Looking at the cavalry, after a while, Charlie murmured, "That's the messenger, what happened?" If you read it correctly, it should be the flag of the brigade headquarters. Cross, you gather the soldiers here, and I'll check the situation. The captain instructed, and then trotted all the way to the direction of the messenger. Charlie shrugged and decided to stop thinking about this problem, and instead looked at the reward given to him by the system. The task of killing 40 enemies under 3 salvos of a platoon of 60 soldiers was really simple, and he completed it very smoothly. This task is rewarded by the system. The mission is completed, a team of hunters has been recruited, and 2,000 gold coins have been issued. A hunter, I didn't expect that a hunter would be drawn. If the hunters are described in modern terms, they are more like snipers. They prefer to hide in bunkers and wait for the enemy to approach, and snipe the enemy with their precise marksmanship. They are good at ambush and harass the enemy from a distance. Accurate marksmanship brings a shortcoming in close combat. They will suffer heavy losses when they face each other, especially when they are charged by cavalry. In fact, Charlie prefers to draw line infantry or more elite grenadiers. These two are the mainstream infantry troops in the current war. Instead of worrying about the trooper, Charlie turned his attention to the reward of 2,000 gold coins. If these 2,000 gold coins are exchanged for the real world, it would be a huge wealth. The Rumont Kingdom adopts the gold and silver double standard system. This system refers to the currency system that uses both gold and silver as the standard currency at the same time. Its characteristics are, both gold and silver are designated as legal tender, and both coins are the main currency, both can be freely minted, both have the effect of unlimited repayment, and both can be freely minted, circulated, exchanged, exported, and imported. In the narrow sense, the gold and silver double standard system can also be divided into parallel standard system and double standard system. The Lan Kingdom adopts the dual standard system, that is, the exchange ratio between gold coins and silver coins is determined by official legislation or other compulsory methods. Prohibiting ordinary people to make changes helps to stabilize commodity prices. Compared with the parallel standard system, which is not conducive to the needs of social development, the dual standard system is more popular in various countries. In addition to the gold and silver coins as the local currency, there are also cheaper copper coins circulating in the market of the kingdom as auxiliary coins. These auxiliary coins are basically used in daily sporadic transactions or change. The exchange rates of the three metal coins are not uniform. The ratio of copper coins to silver coins is 60:1, and the ratio of silver coins to gold coins is 40:1. Because the use of silver coins is more common, the army is paid in silver coins. The salary of Lieutenant Charlie is 200 Rumont silver per month. This kind of income is already high in the Rumont Kingdom, and ordinary bred in Ankerton City the monthly income of the workshop workers is only about 120 silver coins. The recruitment fee and maintenance fee of the system army use gold coins, but the price is not the price in the game in Charlie's memory, it seems to be twice as high as that. For example, the recruitment fee of the line infantry is 968 gold coins, and the maintenance fee is 292 gold coins. With Charlie's current fortune, without relying on the strength of the family, he can recruit another line of infantry and maintain it for several months without going bankrupt. Pulled away. While Charlie was thinking, the soldiers who went to chase down the routed soldiers also withdrew one after another. Their faces were smeared by the smoke from the burning of gunpowder, but they were all excited, obviously not since the victory just now. Out of joy. Charlie didn't let them be silly. Under his order, the soldiers began to count and check the number of losses in the company. It didn't take long for him to learn of the battle losses in this battle. Of the 120 people in the entire company, only 8 unlucky ones were hit by the muskets of the Okolos. 3 of them were hit and died on the spot. The other 5 were also injured to varying degrees. The most seriously injured may not be able to return to the fortress. This is the battlefield of the era of queuing and shooting. Soldiers bravely marched against the enemy's shooting. They did not know where a bullet would hit them in the next second, even if the accuracy of the musket was improved with the development of technology. But most people's shooting still relies on metaphysics to decide whether to hit or not. Not long after Charlie's formation was completed, Captain Doyle walked back from the battalion headquarters. Just as Charlie was about to step forward to inquire, he saw him wave his hand to himself, and then stood in front of all the soldiers of the company with a solemn expression. "I just got the news from the battalion headquarters that the Army Department ordered the 2nd Brigade to return to Ankerton City to suppress the rebel mob in the Ankerton region." Chaos Party mob? Charlie frowned slightly and looked at Doyle with puzzled eyes. The latter did not respond to him, but adjusted the triangular cap on his head and said sharply, "All stand at attention, turn left. Go to Edford Fortress. Go ahead." The 3rd Battalion, which had just destroyed an enemy army, had not had time to rest before returning to Fort Edford with the order of the brigade headquarters. The battlefield here was left to the supply team they rescued to clean up. There are very few officers like Doyle who will tell the brigade orders. Most of the soldiers don't know what happened. They are still complaining that they are not given a chance to clean the battlefield and pick up leaks, but they are quickly affected by those expressions. The solemn officer scolded, "Shut up." During the march, Charlie had the opportunity to ask Doyle about the rioters. Although he was mentally prepared with Anton's reminder, he did not expect a riot to happen. Things are a bit complicated. Yu reading www.yuyugonshu.com. Facing Charlie's question, Doyle said he didn't know too much. The only thing I know at the moment is that the workers in the Ankerton region started to strike, asking the king to lower the taxing them. The strike quickly turned into a riot, joined by some ignorant peasants and poor people piling up on the city streets, who started smashing shops and hanging the mayor and sheriff of Betos. You also know that most of the kingdom's army is transferred here to fight the enemy in the north. The army that can be transferred in the country is almost zero except for the weak local garrison. Our brigade has just withdrawn from the front line and has been repaired. I guess that's why the War Department sent us back to Ankerton to suppress the insurrection. After listening to his remarks, Charlie felt something suspicious. He analyzed. The king convened a cabinet meeting not long ago to raise the tax rate for factory owners, businessmen, and farmers, and it didn't take long for a riot to occur. There must be some tricks in it. What do you mean? Doyle squinted at him, was silent for a few seconds, and then said the answer in Charlie's heart. Do you think it's the ghosts of those new nobles? Indeed so. Charlie nodded. Cross. Even if it's a ghost from the new nobles, what does this have to do with us? We just need to obey orders. As for the dirty politics, let the bureaucrats themselves go mix it up. After speaking, he added another sentence and muttered, but this is a good thing for us, at least we don't have to go back to that cruel battlefield. Charlie looked at him in amazement, and then he noticed that the captain's face was already full of tiredness, and he had only seen this look in his memory from an old man who had returned from military service in his family. Ankerton City, the capital of the Ankerton region, is the most dazzling treasure in the crown of King Rumont, and is also the political and economic center of the country. The quaint capital has undergone earth-shaking changes after the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. The buildings in the eastern part of the city have been torn down and rebuilt, and factories with towering chimneys have been erected one after another, bringing wealth and grey smog together. The people here, of course, only the upper class can enjoy the wealth brought by the Industrial Revolution, and the smog is the gift to the lower class. In a Gothic-like building with a soaring roof on the east side of Ankerton, a debate is going on. The War Department's order has been issued. The 2nd Brigade stationed at Fort Edford is on its way back to Ankerton City. We don't have much time left. So what? Could it be that King Lauren would allow the savage army to kill in his capital? That would only become a big laughingstock in the international community. Come on, Addis, everyone knows that you have a noble title on you. Even if they kill you, they won't be able to kill you. Humph, I didn't come here to quarrel with you. Our goal is very clear, and that is to pull down the rotten King Lauren. I'm afraid those outsiders who call themselves the Santos Party don't have the same idea as you. A voice came from outside the door, which immediately attracted the attention of everyone in the room. People turned their attention to the person who entered the room. Their expressions were different, ranging from surprise, disdain, joy, and hostility. Gould, what are you doing here? Who let you in? One of the people in the room stood up and asked the person who came. The purpose of my coming here is to tell you that you are in a disaster. The man named Gould said disdainfully, and he looked at his eyes from everyone in the room without fear, and continued. The Santos Party has used their rhetoric to win over the short-sighted workers and formed a so-called workers' commando among the workers. What they claim is to overthrow the royal family and establish a republic without the rule of the king, and have the opposite purpose. What will happen to you in front of the angry mob? What? How dare they? This is different from what we said at the beginning. There was a lot of discussion, and the bearded man sitting on the main seat finally moved. He slowly raised his head, looked at Gould, and asked calmly, So, what does your master, Duke Alan, have any good ideas? It's very simple, as long as you support my master Duke Valenti as the new king, he is willing to use his own strength to help you overthrow King Lauren. he and his family have ruled this kingdom for too long, and it's time let this country have a stronger master. Even if those thugs unite, they can't have a well-trained army of the god of war, not to mention that they don't have many muskets. As long as you are willing to support my master, not only will your success rate be greatly increased, but you don't have to worry about the thugs." Gould spoke in a low tone, like a succubus capable of seducing the human mind. Hearing his words, Viscount Edgar Knox in the main seat began to be moved. But he did not agree immediately, and he asked back, "The Duke is willing to guarantee the rights and interests of our newly promoted nobles? We have had enough of being treated as fat sheep and have been the target of oppression. As long as the Duke is willing to guarantee our due rights and interests, all new nobles will support the rule of the Duke, and we are also willing to pay to help the Duke fight against King Lauren's army. Of course, but it's obviously inappropriate for me to discuss this important matter with you. The Duke's eldest son, Master Curender, is already waiting in the carriage across the street. Please come up immediately." Before Gould finished speaking, Viscount Knox stood up and said. Seeing his attitude, Gould's mouth rose slightly. He knew that his purpose of coming here had been achieved. At the same time, in a basement in the east side of Ankerton, the leader of the Santos party, Iker Santos, had a bright smile on his face, and he held a musket that had been wiped with oil in his hand. Talking to the man standing in front of him. "Thanks to Lord Weskier and the muskets for your country's assistance. I think with these muskets, our success rate in overthrowing King Lauren can become higher. Your Excellency Santos, these rifles are just the beginning, and our people will bring in more rifles in the future, but although your country's control is like a sieve, we still can't bring in artillery. It doesn't matter, the battlefield of the uprising will be located on the streets of Ankerton City. No matter how brutal the king's army is, it is impossible to use artillery bombardment in the capital." Santos said confidently, "We are familiar with every street in this city. Architecture, as long as they are trained, no one can beat us in street battles. Your Excellency Santos, complacency will only make you fail." Clifford Weskier said solemnly, "According to our information, King Lauren has dispatched the 2nd Brigade to return to Ankerton. The 2nd Brigade is nicknamed the Blood Lion. You must not underestimate them." Hearing this, Santos's face turned a lot, and he asked, "How many days will the 2nd Brigade arrive?" "Within half a month." UU reading www.uugonshu.com. Then we're running out of time, the workers' commandos must start training right away, and I have to get in touch with that greedy guy Edgar Knox. At least our short-term goal is to overthrow King Lauren. Rule. Santos said seriously. Seeing Santos' clear thinking, Weskier nodded in relief. He continued, "Although our country cannot participate in the war to respond to your actions, our country will always assist you with weapons, Your Excellency Santos." "Thank you very much," Santos said solemnly, then handed the rifle in his hand to the cronies standing beside him, and reached out and shook hands with Weskier. "So, Nisk is willing to support me as the new king." Eden Manor on the outskirts of Ankerton, this is a beautiful aristocratic manor, where the well-respected Duke of Ireland Helvin Valenti lived. At this time, he was sitting on the soft sofa, looking lazily at the eldest son Kalund, who was sitting beside him, and listening to the other party's report. "Yes, father, Nisk is willing to support you and convince other new nobles," the young and vigorous Kalund said, with a little excitement in his eyebrows. "Father, once the riot breaks out, it's the new King Rumont." "Oh, it's not that simple." Old Helvin waved his hand, his expression was indifferent, as if he was not the one who would be pushed to the throne. "Don't think that the king is so easy to do, Kalunder, you have to learn how to manage a country now. Of course, before that, I will remove all obstacles for you." "I understand, father," Curender said respectfully. "Well, go and prepare a letter for me. If I remember correctly, the 2 heads of the 2nd Brigade are our people." "Your Majesty, the commander of the 2nd Brigade, Brigadier Berlan, has sent a letter. The department has arrived in the Ankerton region and is heading to Bedos to suppress the mob. In the city of Ankerton, in the splendid sauna palace, King Lauren XI, who was in his prime, sat behind his desk and listened to the young guards reporting news from the army to him. The king was silent for a while, then commanded in a vicious tone, "Tell Belan, don't be merciless, all the pariahs involved in the riot will be executed, and the leaders among them will be caught alive as much as possible, and I will hang them on the street lamp." "As ordered, Your Majesty." The attendant replied with a touch of his chest, and then he reminded in a low voice, "Your Majesty, Prime Minister Ralgon is already waiting outside for your summons. Let him in." The king's voice fell, and the attendant turned and walked out of the study. It didn't take long for Kator Ralgon, who was wearing a palace-embroidered dress, to enter the study under the guidance of the attendant. He kissed King Lauren who was on the throne. When he straightened his chest, with the help of the light in the study, it could be seen that the Prime Minister's face was no longer young, his temples were white and his body was thin, but no one dared to despise him, because he was King Lauren's important arm. "Your Majesty, I heard that Brigadier General Berlan and his 2nd Brigade have entered the Ankerton region, preparing to suppress the riot in Bedos town." "Yes, Ralgon, I have ordered Berlan to kill all the untouchables who participated in the riot," the king said, motioning for Largan to sit on the chair opposite him. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid you are looking for the wrong target," said the aged Prime Minister, shaking his head, while leaning on the handle of the chair. He slowly sat on the wooden palace chair covered with soft velvet cushions. "Our real enemy is not the one in Bedos town. Those thugs, but the new aristocrats in Ankerton, and the Santos party that has recently emerged among the common people." "The Santos party? I have heard that their leader is the son of a businessman who returned from training in the Republic of Arden." "Why, this is just a trivial new group," King Lauren said disapprovingly. "According to past practice, the group will not shake his regime at all. Liberty, democracy, and equality are not words that have only been circulated in recent years. As early as more than 50 years ago, some people have put forward this theoretical idea in the Republic of Arden, and actively put it into practical use, but it was quickly adopted by the Republic of Arden. The parliament was brutally repressed, and it has been unsuccessful since then. Compared with the so-called freedom, democracy, and equality, the short-sighted people at the bottom care more about whether they can make money and eat enough. Therefore, not many people will pay attention to those ideologues who wave their flags, and governments of various countries will start from the beginning. The stern vigilance of the past has turned into the present laxity. My dear Majesty, perhaps you should really go out of the sauna palace and take a look outside." Prime Minister Lalgan sighed, and he pointed to the night view outside the window, and said in a serious tone, "The workers in Ankerton city have started to strike. Now, the Santos party has won the support of most of the workers, and secretly formed a so-called workers' commando. If we continue to let them develop, the final consequences will be unbearable for us." "Worker commandos? It's ridiculous." The king sneered, and his tone was full of contempt. "What can they do with the support of the workers? Do they have guns? Do they have guns? Under the iron hoof of the royal army, they will only be wiped out." It is true that King Lauren would have been nervous if it was in the cold weapon period, but now is the era dominated by muskets and cannons. No matter how many people resist, they don't have enough muskets and artillery in their hands. In the face of the elite kingdom army when there is only one end of being destroyed. Therefore, King Lauren is not worried about the climate of the Santos party. He is more concerned about whether he can get more wool and more money from the new nobles. After falling into a two-front war, the kingdom's treasury expenditure was severely depleted, and the money in it would soon run out. If he could not receive a large amount of taxes in a short period of time, he would face the dilemma of no military pay. There is no need to wait for the Santos party to attack, the angry army has enough for him to drink. Seeing that King Lauren has always been indifferent, Largan suddenly fell into a deep sense of powerlessness. He couldn't help but start to think about what caused him, an old friend who had been working with him for decades, to become like this. After thinking about it, the target was quickly locked on a person. Lucia Salomon, Queen of King Lauren. Since the marriage between King Lauren and Lucia's mother's family Becky Kingdom 6 years ago, the originally ambitious King Lauren was immersed in the gentle village as if he had lost his soul, and became the ghost he is now. If not convinced that there is no witchcraft in this world, Ralgon even doubts that Queen Lucia is a witch with the ability to deceive the mind. At this moment, King Lauren remembered the newly promoted nobles that Ralgon just mentioned. He frowned slightly and asked, "What happened to those newly promoted nobles?" "My informant told me that Viscount Knox, the leader of the new nobles, had contact with the Duke of Ireland yesterday. Although I don't know what agreement they reached, I suspect that they will be detrimental to the royal family." Ralgon was serious. Said. "Damn, how dare they!" The king was suddenly furious. He slapped the table heavily and shouted, "Did they forget who gave them rich wealth? What a bunch of witty wolves that they don't know well." After finishing speaking, he looked at Ralgon viciously again and said, "Ralgon, since they want to betray me, don't blame me for being ruthless, wait for the 2nd Brigade to come back. No, don't wait for them, I'll let the Praetorian Guard raid their home tonight." Hearing King Lauren's declaration, Ralgon, whose face changed greatly, hurriedly stopped and said, "Your Majesty, now we don't have enough evidence to attack the newly promoted nobles. If you rashly send the Imperial Guards to raid the house, it will only cause other problems. Noble dissatisfaction and backlash. Then shall we let the gang of witty wolves and the Duke of Ireland conspire against me?" The king said angrily, but he was also calmer at the same time. Obviously, Ralgon's persuasion took effect. Although King Lauren has shortcomings such as irritability, greed for money, arrogance, short-sightedness, etc., he is still able to listen to the persuasion of others, especially the persuasion of his most trusted Prime Minister Ralgon. Seeing that the king's mood was much calmer, Largan continued, "Let's wait and see. I will secretly collect evidence of the rebellion of the newly promoted nobles and the Duke of Elan, and wait for the 2nd Brigade to suppress the mob in Bedos town and return to safety. After Ketan City, we'll take action against the newly promoted nobles." "Okay, Ralgon, just do as you say." Far from the town of Bedos, the commander of the 2nd Brigade, Harvey Barron, was standing on a hill far from town, unaware that he and his army had become the center of attention for the royal family and new nobles. Holding a monocular to observe the mob in town. "Baden, it seems that the mob didn't build fortifications after occupying the town, and they carelessly exposed the defenseless streets to our army's attack route. It's ridiculous," Brigadier General Barron said, and handed the monocular to the adjutant who was standing half a meter behind him. After the latter took the telescope, he suggested, "General, then we can directly launch a charge and defeat the mob entrenched inside in one fell swoop to recover the town." I think it only takes a few cannons to fire into the town, and the rabble will be defeated by themselves." Bel-Elan said disdainfully, but he was not prepared to do so, and instead asked, "Baden, when will the troops deployed in and out of the town be in place?" "Just 10 minutes ago, General," the adjutant replied. "Okay, then sound the horn of attack, surround all the mob, and I will annihilate them all. The 3rd Battalion, advance. Destroy all the mob, for the king." When the attack bugle of the 2nd Brigade was blown, the mob squatting in the town was horrified to find that they had been surrounded by the kingdom's army. They were just a mob instigated by some people. At first, people just came with the purpose of taking the opportunity to grab a wave. After killing the mayor and the sheriff, most people saw that the situation was not good and ran away, and the rest who stayed here were either lucky people, or diehards. And they are obviously not the opponents of the elite kingdom army. Watching countless soldiers in blue uniforms marching neatly towards the town, the mob who stayed behind suddenly panicked, and some of them hurriedly took advantage of the chaos to hide in all directions. The alleys pretend to be civilians, and the few gunmen who the weapons of the town's militiamen roam the streets like headless flies. The gunmen quickly became targets for the line of infantry entering the town, and within an hour of a spate of sporadic gunfire, the 2nd Brigade occupied the town and took the surrendering mobs and the locals. The deserters confessed by the residents were all driven to the square in the center of the town. Like many of the soldiers, Charlie thought they only needed to string the prisoners back to Ankerton with twine, but they were surprised by the order from Brigadier General Burland. According to His Majesty's order, the leader of the riot will be taken away, and the rest of the mob participating in the riot will be shot on the spot. The expressionless messenger turned and left after conveying his superior's order. Some unacceptable. Charlie looked at Captain Doyle. The soul of the 21st century from civilization made him resist the order to shoot the prisoners of war even if the Japanese invaders were shot and executed for all their crimes. These nominally mob people only rose up to resist the oppression. Captain Doyle didn't pay any attention to Charlie's emotions. He also looked at the kneeling prisoners of war with a blank expression. After the soldiers who came forward to check out the instigator hiding inside, he took a deep breath, and then ordered the soldiers to raise their guns with the other captains of the company. "Everyone has it, raise your gun." Swish aim. When the prisoners found that the soldiers were raising their guns at them, they suddenly became agitated. Some of them shouted loudly, and then almost all of them stood up and looked at the soldiers raising their guns with despair. Facing their gazes, Charlie only felt his scalp tingle, and some of the soldiers in the company began to make noise. Most of them were recruits who had been drafted to defend their homeland and the country before going on the battlefield. The Okalos were transferred back to the capital after fighting, and now their first mission is to slaughter unarmed prisoners. Or their compatriots. The officers didn't have the soldiers' concerns, they yelled at the soldiers who didn't dare to shoot. Captain Doyle kicked a soldier with weak legs, and yelled at him, "The opposite is the thugs who resisted the king. Don't show mercy to them, shoot." Under the curses and reprimands of the officers, the soldiers had no choice but to raise their weapons again, point the muzzle at the prisoners, and pull the trigger. When the last mob captive fell to the ground, the whole town square was filled with pungent gunpowder smoke and a strong smell of blood. Charlie looked numbly at the slaughterhouse that was almost bleeding into a river. Chu reacted. There is no Geneva Convention or humanitarianism in this world. In the eyes of those who master force, human life is just a series of cold numbers. At this moment, Captain Doyle walked to Charlie's side, raised his hand and patted his shoulder heavily, pulling Charlie's thoughts back. Charlie looked up at him. Doyle's face was full of tiredness, and he said, "Cross, if I remember correctly, you were transferred to be my second lieutenant last May." "Yes, sir." You reading www.ukansha.com. Charlie nodded in agreement, not knowing what his intentions were. "I know that officers like you who have just graduated from the military academy are reluctant to shoot prisoners of war, but this is something you have to endure and get used to when you become a mature commander," he said. His eyes drifted not far away. The pale-faced second lieutenant, who is said to have just graduated from the military academy and took to the battlefield for the first time, was assigned to take over the vacancy left by Charlie's promotion. Charlie didn't speak. He looked at Doyle quietly. The latter was silent for a few seconds, and continued, "Klaus, sometimes killing prisoners of war is also a necessary choice. After a big war, the prisoners left by the enemy are usually tricky. If we don't properly place them, they threaten us like dynamite that could explode at any time, so we'll just have to deal with them on the spot when necessary. Fix this problem once and for all." Charlie nodded. He understood the truth. If it were him, he would have given this order without hesitation. Thinking of this, he suddenly felt that he had a double standard. Why he could order soldiers to shoot enemy prisoners of war without hesitation, and what about the unacceptable shooting of these mob prisoners? And the mob in front of you, shooting them on the spot can effectively deter other outlaws who are just around the corner. Cross, I hope you can understand this. You are still very young, and you still have a long way to go in the future. Go, maybe you will give the same order as His Majesty the King in the future. Doyle boldly predicted. After he finished speaking, the corners of his mouth twitched, he pulled out a bitter smile, and continued to talk to Charlie. When we return to Ankerton, I have a hunch that this kind of thing will continue to happen, but our enemy is very likely into angry civilians.